Lesson 3, Who Will Rescue This Family? In our series on the story of Joseph. We will be looking at Genesis chapter 38 today, where Joseph's story takes an unexpected detour as the author shifts his focus from Joseph to his older brother Judah, who was, as we saw last time, the functional leader of God's family, although he wasn't behaving like one at all. Until late in the story for today, he is confronted, after which he confesses, which is the first step of transformation. The story of Joseph is all about transformation. And today we learn not just Joseph's transformation, but others, even ours. My friend Steve Brown likes to say, if you play poker and you're never willing to risk, you will never win. This story is risky, if not risque. We won't have time to read every verse, so if you have a Bible nearby, please have it ready to refer to along the way. Verse 1 of Genesis 38 begins, "At that time," which refers to the story before, when Judah and his brothers sold Joseph into slavery. You'll remember their original plan was to kill him, but it was Judah who had the alternative, but still wicked idea, to sell him. Which means Judah bursts on the scene of Genesis as a slave trader of his very own brother, after which he leaves his brothers to go to Canaan to hang out with his friend Hira, which tells us more about Judah. Since God had forbidden his people to interact with the Canaanites, Judah goes even further. He marries a Canaanite woman, the daughter of Shua, and together they have 3 sons. The first is whose name in Hebrew, when spelled backwards, is the same word for evil. Marries Tamar, but God puts him to death because he lived up to his name in reverse. Following Er's death, Judah commands Onan, his second son, to marry Tamar in order to raise up offspring for his brother. More on that in a minute. But Onan refuses in one of the most graphic scenes in the entire Bible, so God puts him to death too. And then finally, there's Shelah, who we know absolutely nothing about. That brings us to verse 11. Judah, fearing the same fate for his third and only son, Shelah, fails to see the connection between his son's wickedness and their death. Instead, he superstitiously blames Tamar, sending her back home with a promise he has no intention of keeping. "Live as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up," he tells her. And this may all sound very strange, if not offensive. God putting people to death, a father commanding his younger son to marry the widow of his oldest son, but the latter was actually a Hebrew law. It was designed to protect and provide for widows because they were so marginalized, and, particularly significant to this story, ensure that the family's line continued. In other words, Judah's refusal to give Tamar to his only son guaranteed his family line would end. Tamar not only knew this, it's what motivated her to take an incredible risk, a righteous risk, to rescue God's family, which ironically was not even her family, by blood at least. We've highlighted this before, but a big question in Joseph's story is who is the leader of this family? On the detour today, we pause to consider a related question. Who will rescue this family? And the answer is very unexpected. Someone outside God's family is going to rescue God's family. 2 truths are revealed. The first involves Tamar. Hers is the risk that righteousness requires. The second, of course, involves Judah. His transformation is triggered by her righteousness. A story like this is rare, but not in the Bible. A scandalous story with righteousness at the core. In his book, Fools for Christ, Yaroslav Pelikan compares 2 characters from Dostoevsky's classic Crime and Punishment. He writes, in sharp contrast to the pride of Raskolnikov stood the meekness of Sonia, who lived with her father and stepmother in great poverty as a result of her father's wild living. The suffering this brought on their family could not be alleviated unless they sold some property. to buy food for their hungry children. But the only thing that anyone would buy was Sonia's body, so she became a prostitute. It was not out of lust or greed that she adopted this way of life, nor was she unmindful of the fact that she was guilty of immorality. The tragic choice simply lay between starvation for her stepmother and the children and prostitution for herself. Out of love for the family, she sold her body. Pelikan continues, if holy is identified with moral, Sonia broke her ties with the holy when she began to live a life of sin. Yet in Dostoevsky's novel, she's a heroine, a kind of saint. And then he powerfully concludes, her adultery was holier than the virginity of many. Raskolnikov acted out of an egocentric belief that he held claim on another person's life, but Sonia acted out of the belief that her family held claim to her life. Old Testament scholar Bruce Waltke writes, the righteous are willing to disadvantage themselves in order to advantage the community. The wicked are willing to disadvantage the community in order to advantage themselves. Fast forward now to the climactic end of this story in verse 26, where Judah pronounces the following verdict, she is more righteous than I. He gets it. Up until this moment, though, Judah lived his life as if no one held claim to it. But Tamar acted out of a much different belief that others, even those not in her blood family, absolutely held claim to her life. Now, what about you? Who holds claim to your life? From the Christian perspective, God, of course, but also neighbor. And though neighbor technically includes everyone, I challenge you to give priority to those you live with, your real physical neighbors, your blood relatives, your family, even if they're dysfunctional. Is there any other kind of family? Your closest friends, including those who gossip about you behind your back and those who betray you in your back. Your co-workers, the ones that bless you and the ones that annoy the bleep out of you. And finally, the church. Because if you're a follower of Jesus, not only does Jesus hold claim to your life, he most certainly does, but his body, the church, also holds claim to your life. Imagine what it might look like for you to disadvantage yourself in order to advantage the community. You see, righteousness is not a static, impersonal thing. It's dynamic, personal, relational. Righteousness is not so much doing the right thing as it is loving people the right way. And you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who embraced this more fully than Tamar, though it's so unexpected. Her story is told in 3 parts, each with a chronological marker. Verse 1 began at that time. The second part begins in verse 12, after a long time. After a long time, Judah's wife died. And a careful reader wonders what's going to happen now that Judah's wife is dead, because he can't possibly have any more sons. And the only son he does have, Shelah, has already been denied the only woman, Tamar, who could have become his wife by law to keep the family line going. Once again, who is going to rescue this family? Verse 12 provides the hinge upon which everything turns. When Judah had recovered from his grief, what's going to happen? A righteous Judah would have kept his promise to Tamar, even though it was empty when he made it. A righteous Judah would have gone to her house, brought her back to his house to marry Shelah. Instead, he meets up again with his friend Hira, and they take a trip to shear some sheep. This is the author's way of telling his audience, Judah is still very lost. But the moment Tamar, who's not lost, hears that her father-in-law is on the way, she springs into action. She takes off her widow's clothes, disguises herself with a veil, sits down at the entrance to a city on the way to the city where they're going. And the author tells us why at the end of verse 14. She saw that though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. The moment Judah sees her, having covered her face, he assumes she's a prostitute. Waste no time. Come now, let me sleep with you. Judah falls headlong into Tamar's deceptive but deeply devoted hands. She plays Judah the way all men are played when they see sex as a means to gratify themselves instead of God's plan to give of themselves. It's much easier to be a consumer with any woman who will say yes than to be a covenant partner with one woman, where the man and the woman have the courage to say no for a time, until they are ready to say, yes, I will, for a lifetime. Returning to the story, verse 16, Judah, come now, let me sleep with you. Tamar, what will you give me to sleep with you? Judah, I'll send you a young goat from my flock. Tamar, will you give me something as a pledge until you send it? Judah, what pledge should I give you? I mean, I'll give you whatever you ask as long as I get what I want. Tamar, your seal, its cord, and the staff in your hand. Little does Judah realize that his lustful escape, fresh on the heels of mourning the loss of his wife, will blow up in his face and cost him dearly. But like most blow-ups that cost us dearly, this also has the potential to trigger his transformation. The author, after pausing to give intimate details of their conversation, compresses the rest at the end of verse 18. He gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. Which lands Tamar, of all people, in Matthew's genealogy. She becomes the first woman listed in the line of Jesus because she provides a powerful picture of Jesus. She had become what she was not for a time in order to do for Judah what he wouldn't do for himself. Waltke concludes her faithful deception wins her a place in the messianic lineage. In her daring ruse, she acts quickly, decisively, and shrewdly, qualities commendable in a king. The King of Kings may come from Judah's line, but he looks a whole lot more like Tamar. Jesus became what he was not, for a time, sin, in order to be for us what we could never be ourselves, righteous. There's no Lion of Judah without Tamar being in the line of Judah. The third and final section of the story begins in verse 24. About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant. What follows is quite possibly the clearest picture of hypocrisy ever recorded. Judah explodes at the end of verse 24. Bring her out! Have her burned to death! Oh, how sin blinds us! Sin makes us so stupid. But there's more here than meets the eye. Don't just write Judah off as stupid. See yourself in him. An unexpected opportunity falls into his lap for him to rid himself of the claim that Tamar has on his life. Remember, as long as Tamar is alive, she's his only lawful option for his only son. But if she dies, Shelah is free to marry someone else. As misguided and selfish as Judah is, he still wants to keep his family line going. He just doesn't want to do it God's way. So he jumps at the chance to have Tamar burned to death because news of her prostitution-induced pregnancy presents him with an out. The out he's been looking for, a chance to keep his family going without doing it God's way. In the process, Tamar becomes the woman nobody wants. But the irony is, the woman nobody wants is going to rescue God's family. It plays out in one of the more unforgettable scenes in all the Bible. But first, we need to pause and consider a question. Do you see yourself here in Judah? Are you ever looking for an out so you don't have to live your life God's way? Before Tamar exposes Judah, he tries to send her the goat he promised her. But he sends it by his friend Hira. This is back in verse 20. Instead of going himself. Waltke notes, Judah is like a reputable gentleman who unwittingly loses his credit card in a brothel. Only his reputation concerns him. Of course, Hira can't find Tamar. She's not on the street anymore. And the particulars here are so interesting. The devil, as they say, is in the details. Judah has enough honor to keep his promise to a shrine prostitute. But he doesn't have the honor to keep his promise to his own daughter-in-law. It's no coincidence they are one and the same person. It's also no coincidence that the gospel is all over this story. Judah willing to give her a goat, but not willing to give her his only son. The gospel is God sent his one and only son to be our goat. Caught in our sin, God didn't explode and say, bring them out and put them to death. Instead, he looks back now to the sacrifice of his son when he brought his son out and put him to death in our place. Returning to that climactic scene, it takes place beginning in verse 25. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. I am pregnant by the man who owns these. See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are. It's the ultimate I gotcha. He thinks he's got her, but she's actually got him. She meets trickery with trickery. Confronted with his failure, though, beauty enters the story. Judah finally owns up to his deception. She's more righteous than I, which is better translated, she is righteous, not me. Old Testament scholar George Wenham writes, in its biographical sketches, character change is what Genesis is all about, and here in Genesis 38, her righteousness triggers his transformation. He names his sin, I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah. Then he acts in faith, he didn't sleep with her again. His transformation will later reach a high watermark in chapter 44 as this former slave trader of his own brother offers himself as a slave in place of his youngest brother, Benjamin. Near the end of his life, Judah fully recognizes that his family holds absolute claim to his life, and he willingly disadvantages himself in order to advantage them. Your family, not you, your Christian family holds claim to your life. If you're a follower of Jesus, this is precisely what you have signed up for. Jesus will always require more of you than you could ever imagine giving him. But at the very same time, he will always give you more than you could ever dream possible. If Judah can change, you can change. But in order to change, you have to encounter righteousness. And righteousness is risky. Just as Judah said of Tamar, she is righteous, not me. God calls us to say, Jesus is righteous, not me. If you desire to change, to take risks that righteousness requires, the first step is to be transformed by admitting that he alone is righteous and you are not. Amen.